Hello, I've got Betsy here with me again. Sorry, she's my guest star always. I'm sorry that hopefully we'll make it through without tears this time. But this one is kind of a long lecture because I really want to try to get through all of our chapter on Congress today, and then that'll be it for your lecture for this week. It's going to be a little bit longer of a lecture, so if you need to watch this in multiple parts, that's fine. Thank you for everybody for taking your exam last week. I have been tinkering with some stuff on my end, so if you can't see your grade right now, it's not a problem. If you took it, I've got your grade, it's fine. If you have not taken it, please email me. I know there were some complications for a couple folks, and please just email me if that's you. We'll see to it that everything is taken care of. Woo, sorry. All right, today, so man, Congress, I could talk about it forever because this is where I've spent most of my career. I'm currently a lobbyist and I lobby Congress, which we will talk about more what that means later on. But what it means, when I've worked for Congress, I've worked for a number of different committees. I've worked for a few different members of Congress. I worked for a senator. And so I've got a lot of background in this and I could really talk about it. Uh-oh, you dropped your toy. I'm gonna grab that and keep talking. I could talk about Congress for a long time. So if I get off track, I'll try to steer back, but hopefully my experience makes this a little more interesting. All right, let me dive in before I lose complete track. All right, so the chapter kind of starts talking about what's at stake in the Senate's obligation to give advice and consent to the president. Okay, this is something we're really dealing with right now. The Constitution says, so this book was written a few years ago, but it's super relevant again right now, so I'm excited to talk about this. The Constitution says the president can nominate with advice and consent of the Senate, a member of the Supreme Court, right? It is a very purposely vague language. It's intended to put a legislative check on presidents while keeping primary control in their hands. So in February of 2016, Justice Scalia passed away. Now in 2016, we had President Obama as our president. So we had a Democratic president and a Republican-led Senate and a Republican-led House. Mitch McConnell was and is the majority leader in the United States Senate. He is Republican. He had a Democrat president at that time. It's now, obviously, we have a Republican president and a Republican Senate. How the House of Representatives right now is led by the Democrats. But that's not relevant for what I'm talking about. Okay, so in 2016, Scalia died, and Mitch McConnell said the people should have a say in his replacement. He said, we're about to elect a new president. It's election year. Obama's term is up. He obviously, Obama would have nominated a more liberal judge. He wants to have a Republican get elected and nominate a conservative judge. Remember, a Supreme Court justice is appointed for life. So these are major stakes here. So Obama did nominate. He nominated Merrick Garland, and Mitch McConnell wouldn't even allow his Senate to take it up. They didn't have hearings on it, and he said, we're just going to wait. And then if a new president gets elected in January or in November and it comes in January, he can bring up his person at that point. So he didn't have any hearings on it. He never gave in, and then obviously Donald Trump ended up winning, and he came in and nominated Neil Gorsuch. He was confirmed, and so now there's a conservative person in that spot instead of the more liberal person that Obama would have nominated. But it really raises the question of why couldn't Obama? He was serving a 4-year term. This was in February. His term wasn't up yet. Like he could have nominated and gotten a Supreme Court justice through. All right, why is this relevant right now? Because the exact same thing just happened. Most of you know Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away a few weeks ago, and we now have a Republican president, but we still have Mitch McConnell, who is the leader of the Senate, and he is also Republican. This time, he has changed his mind. He's decided, let's push through a Republican nominee. So obviously, Donald Trump nominated Amy Barrett a couple weeks ago to fill RBG's seat, and Mitch McConnell is vowing to get this pushed through before Donald Trump's term is up, so he can fill this seat with a conservative judge in case Joe Biden wins. It would bring in a Democrat for that seat. So How interesting that the exact same thing has happened 2 times in a row. Mitch McConnell has done 2 different things based on his own party. Now, you may be thinking, how dare he, how hypocrite, what a hypocrite, but if you were in his position, wouldn't you do the same thing? Don't you want to preserve your own party? It sounds really bad, and it's not great that, he's kind of doing the opposite things. But you do all you can in DC. You do what you can to preserve your own party's power. Like, it's a crazy, crazy world. All right, anyway, I could talk about that for a long time, and I do. I spend a lot of time talking about that right now in my current job. So if you have questions about any of that, let me know. All right, so anyway, that's kind of an aside about how Congress works a little bit. But if politics is who gets what and how, and Congress is the center of American national politics, Congress is getting to decide the what, but it can also alter many of the rules or the how that determines who wins and loses in politics. Congress is generally distrusted, right? They're viewed as incompetent, corrupt, partisan, at the beck and call of special interests. But as individuals, we tend to like them, right? Like, you maybe have met Joe Wilson at a baseball game and say, what a nice guy, or, but when you think about DC as a whole, you're like, oh, Congress is doing a terrible job. There's 2 reasons for this love-hate relationship. The first is that satisfying constituents and a supportive party, they don't always make the institution more popular. Voters want DC representatives to take care of their state and local interests and not to go rogue and vote with the opposite party. But they also want them to take care of the nation's business and to look mature and deliberative. And the second reason is that the rules determine how Congress works were designed by founders to produce a slow and careful lawmaking process that is based on compromise, that often seems motionless to an impatient public. But the safeguards of checks and balances is often forgotten sometimes. I worked for a member of Congress who always would say, when are we going to do something? And it's true. It's very frustrating that things move at almost a glacial pace. But the safeguards are there for a reason. There's 2 dynamics, the legislators struggling to keep their jobs while meeting national expectations versus our own frustration with Congress's slowness. So let's understand Congress a little bit. There are elected officials who perform 2 major roles. They represent us and they make laws. Representation is the efforts of an elected official to look out for the interests of those who elect them. And national lawmaking is the creation of policy to address the problems and the needs of the entire nation. These can often conflict. What's good for us and what our local community may not serve the national good. Members of Congress get reelected by pleasing voters in their districts, so national problems sometimes go unaddressed. Partisanship is a loyalty to a party that helps shape how members see the world, define problems, and identify appropriate solutions. Members of Congress have to be responsive to their constituents and to the nation, but also to their party. So you've got a Republican who is representing you, so he has to go and vote with the Republican Party a lot of times. But he also has to represent you as an individual and you as a constituent. Usually those things go hand in hand, but, it's a lot of things to keep up with. It's an important part of how they identify themselves. Okay, so a constituency. These are voters in a state or a district. You represent them whether they vote for you or not. So whoever gets elected represents everybody, even if you didn't vote for that person, they are still representing you. There's 4 different types of representation. Policy representation. This is congressional work that advances the issues and ideological preferences of constituents. There is allocative representation. This is congressional work that secures like a project, a service, or funds for the district. These used to be called like pork barrel projects, pork for bringing home the bacon, sometimes also referred to as earmarks. Earmarks are banned now. Earmarks are legislative provisions that allocate spending for a specific purpose or project. Pork barrel projects are public works and grants for specific districts paid for by general revenues. So this is like Congress just last week voted to keep the government open. So they have to every year advance a spending bill that says we're going to give this much money to this department, we're going to give this much money to this state, and so on and so forth. Having an earmark or a pork barrel project says, okay, so we're giving this much money to the Department of Transportation, but we want $250 million to go to Lexington, South Carolina to work on this road. That is a specific project. It is bringing it to a local earmark level. they're sort of banned now. We don't really use the term earmark. Sometimes we'll say, this sounds earmarky, like we're not allowed to use that, because you don't want to say, like, I'm voting on this because I want this to happen in my district. It's confusing. There is an effort now to bring back earmarks because it is helpful to say, I want this money to be used for this specific purpose, but it can get really political. Okay, so the third type of representation is casework. And this is what's done kind of at a local level. So like Joe Wilson, I keep saying Joe Wilson because he's our representative here. He has a DC office where they do most of his legislative work. And then he has a local office here in town. So they do most of the casework there. They do legislative work on behalf of individual constituents to solve their problems with government programs and agencies. So like if you need help with immigration or you want a flag flown over the Capitol, this is what the local office usually handles, that sort of casework. Franking is the privilege of free mail service is provided to members of Congress. So you may get a letter from Joe Wilson sometimes that says, hey, this is what I'm working on in DC. That's different than his campaign stuff. That's not free. But this is, just a communication of him saying, this is what I'm working on in DC. But social media is being used more and more for that. And that's not, you don't hear from them through the mail quite as much anymore because honestly, you don't hear from many people in the mail anymore. And the fourth type of representation is called symbolic representation. This is efforts of members of Congress to stand for ideals, American ideals, or to identify with common constituency values. So for example, you have a member of Congress who speaks at a graduation or attends a town hall to tell you what's happening. They tend to speak colloquially, that was hard, to dress like the others around them. So if you're going to the state fair as a member of Congress, you're not going to show up in a suit and tie. Like you're going to show up dressed pretty casually, right? This is supposed to say, I am one of you, you can trust me. National lawmaking. So you have kind of that local angle, and then you kind of look at it nationally also. Congress needs to create laws that serve the common good, the collective responsibility. Congress needs to be responsible for the effectiveness of its laws in solving national problems. There are a variety of factors here. They're guided by conscience, by ideology, by the demands of their constituency. Constituency, remember, that's the group of people that you represent. Interest groups, party positions, they can all be at odds with each other, and that can make it hard to fulfill a collective responsibility. We want a Congress that focuses on the nation's problems, but as voters, we tend to reward members for putting constituent concerns first, right? So, we want Congress to say, keep our government open, but we also want Joe Wilson to work on this project for this specific area of Lexington. So it's hard for that all to work out together. Hyperpartisanship. This is something that I'm going to talk about a lot this semester. We are super hyperpartisan right now. Hyperpartisanship is a commitment to party so strong that it can transcend other commitments. And it can be made worse by increased polarization between the parties. Polarization is the ideological distance between the parties and the ideological homogeneity within them. We are very, very hyperpartisan right now. It makes it hard for folks to compromise. Compromise goes out the window a lot of times now. We've had a few different government shutdowns. We almost had one last week. The government shutdown happens when there's a refusal to pass a budget that allows the government to continue operating. They passed it kind of at the last minute last week and kept the government open until December 11th when they have to vote on it again. They have shut down the government a few times since I have been working in Congress. The one in 2013 was 16 days long, and the one in 2019 was 35 days long. They have different things they kind of fight about during these, and so it's hard to compromise. All right, congressional powers and responsibilities. Founders gave Congress a lot of power, but they couldn't have imagined the scope of contemporary congressional power, since they never anticipated the growth of the federal government to today's size. I mean, they were concerned with the representation of short-term popular opinion and less with the conflict between local and national interests. Okay, so what are some of the differences between the House and the Senate? So Congress is both the House and the Senate. Each Congress is numbered. We are finishing up the 116th Congress right now. Each has a 2-year term because the members of the House have a 2-year term. So we're wrapping up the end of our 116th Congress. In January, we will start the 117th Congress. We have a bicameral legislature here. Bicameral, obviously, bi means two, legislature with 2 chambers. It's laid out in the Constitution that we have a bicameral legislature. They want two chambers to serve as a restraint on each other, strengthening checks and balances. The smaller, more elite Senate would cool the passions of the people represented in the House. They're equal in their overall power. They both can initiate legislation, but the tax bills have to come from the House. Both have to pass every bill in identical form before it can be signed. But there are a few extra responsibilities assigned to the Senate. Okay, so the Senate, there are 100 members in the Senate, 2 from each state. There's less formal rules needed because they're a little bit smaller body. They serve 6-year terms, but on a staggered basis. They're not all running for re-election at the same time. Right now, Senator Lindsey Graham in South Carolina is running for re-election, but Senator Tim Scott in South Carolina is not. They can suspend their campaigning for about 4 or 5 years while they're in DC. So they get reelected, they can go to DC and actually just focus on work for about 4 or 5 years. And then the next year, they really have to focus on campaigning. They must be 30 years old, and they originally were elected by the state legislatures, but in 1913, that was changed to being directly elected by the people. The House of Representatives has 435 members. So it has to have more formal rules and hierarchy to function effectively. They serve 2-year terms in the House, so they basically never stop campaigning. You win this November, you go to DC in January, you start thinking about your campaign for 2 years from now, your 2022 campaign. It really just doesn't stop. What was that? You have to be 25 years old to be a member of the House of Representatives. Budget bills originate in the House, but the Senate also has to pass them. The House also has the power to impeach, but Senate does the impeachment trial. That's something we did earlier this year. My goodness, 2020 has been a long year. Because as you may remember, Donald Trump was, the House voted to impeach Donald Trump in January or February of this year. But the Senate has the actual trial that removes him from office, and the Senate did not vote to remove him from office because obviously the Senate is made up of the same political party as the president, and so they're probably not going to do that. Both Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton were also impeached by the House, but failed to be impeached removed by the Senate. All right, congressional checks and balances. The founders were concerned with executive tyranny, so they granted Congress the bulk of the lawmaking power. The Congress has the responsibility to pass the laws, but they don't become laws until they don't become a law unless the president signs them or refrains from vetoing them, or both houses are able to muster a 2/3 majority to override a presidential veto. The president can't vote or even introduce legislation, but his annual State of the Union address allows him time to recommend such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. Sorry, I've been talking for something. So, congressional oversight. Bless you. Congressional oversight. This is a committee's investigation of the executive and of government agencies to ensure they're acting as Congress intends. This is Congress is overseeing the executive branch this way. And it's kind of keeps checks and balances of the government. It's usually done through hearings and investigations of executive actions. It's essential for Congress to be certain it will be carried out. When parties are controlled by opposite, when you have like the House and Senate and presidency all controlled by different parties, oversight can become a political weapon. Another check on the executive is the requirement that a presidential appointment must be made with advice and consent of the Senate. Like we were talking about earlier, advice and consent is the constitutional obligation that the Senate must approve certain executive appointments. This is like the Senate having to vote on and approve a president's Supreme Court nomination. Some differences in constituencies. The president and Congress look at policy in different terms of a national constituency in their own policy program. So for instance, the president may say, we need a clean air bill, but a member of Congress says, no, that means closing a factory in my district and we would lose a whole bunch of jobs. So I'm going to vote against that. So you have kind of some differences going on there. The House is elected every 2 years. The Senate is elected every 6, and this takes a lot of time. The way a district is drawn can really determine the success of a member of Congress when you run for election. So the Constitution says each state has 2 senators. This is easy. Even Alaska and Hawaii, like they all have two senators. But the House is allocated on the basis of population of a state, which fluctuates over time. So we're going through our census right now, which determines how how many people live in South Carolina, how many members of Congress we need in each state. So these 435 seats are reallocated every 10 years after a census. We are just wrapping up our 2020 census right now. Make sure your household has completed the census so we get a good count. States who have populations who grow gain seats, and those who have populations who shrink lose seats. In the last census, we gained a seat in South Carolina, and we now have 7 members of the House. How do we count people? Most people fill out the questionnaires the Census Bureau sends out, but some, maybe like a homeless person or maybe an immigrant who doesn't understand how to fill out the census, or maybe are afraid that they don't want to be counted because they don't fill it out. They don't want to know, people to know where they are. That makes it complicated. But it's important that everybody be counted. Okay, redistricting. This is the process. So when South Carolina decided that after last census in 2010, we gained a seat that had to be redistricted. That divided the state into different legislative districts. This keeps the districts relatively, they keep it relatively equal in population. One person, one vote. So the districts need to be equal in population. So the average district size is about 700,000 people. But the state legislature decides how the lines are drawn. And if you have a state legislature who's controlled by a certain party, they are gonna try to draw the lines for these districts to most benefit their party. So for instance, maybe a certain neighborhood tends to vote a certain way. They're gonna make sure it kind of gets looped in so that they can guarantee that vote. In your book, it has some good maps about districting. If I were in person with you guys, I'd be drawing on the board and kind of showing you how to do this. Gerrymandering is a way to redistrict to benefit a particular group. It can result in we don't have like a straight the state is divided into 7 equal size triangles or whatever. You gerrymander a little bit to kind of benefit this political party. It can result in some sort of strange shapes that are drawn when you're drawing the shapes of the districts. There are 3 different types of gerrymandering. The first is partisan gerrymandering, and this is, you want to increase the number of districts that a party can be expected to carry. So for example, a legislature controlled by Democrats may draw a district that would split a historically Republican district and force a Republican to run in a new, more liberal district. The second type of gerrymandering is pro-incumbent gerrymandering. This is when legislators agree to create districts to enhance the electoral security of the current members of both parties. When state legislatures are so closely divided that neither party can dictate the redistricting process. And the third is racial gerrymandering. This is redistricting to enhance or reduce the chances that a racial or ethnic group will elect members to the legislature. It remains really controversial. Sometimes they're saying this is, we're drawing it this way to force, having a certain racial or ethnic group be represented, because we're going to drawing it so that population elects this person. The Supreme Court has said that race can't be the predominant factor in drawing this, but it can be taken into account. So other factors like neighborhood and community preservation also may need to be thought about. Okay, so you decide that you want to run for Congress. Let's go through your thought process here. There are no educational requirements, surprisingly. You don't even have to have graduated from high school or college. You just have to meet the age minimum. There are a lot of lighter job qualifications than most jobs you'll apply for when you graduate. But you have to prepare yourself to be exposed to the critical scrutiny of your prospective constituents or opponents. Running for office can be brutal. Going through an ad campaign where, just think about these commercials that you're seeing on TV right now. Like, that's a person. Like, it's, Lindsey Graham, Jamie Harrison. Like, these are people. These are real people. And they have these horrible ads about them that you're seeing all the time right now. Think about their families and how hard it must be to have that kind of scrutiny on you when you're running for office. So why does anybody want this job? Some people are motivated by the desire to serve the public. Some are motivated by ideology, their commitment to enact policies that represents their strongly held values. A member of Congress earns about $174,000, which considers them a top wage earner. But when you think about it, they have to live 2 lives, basically. They maintain 2 residencies. They have to have a residency in DC and then a residency back home. DC is really expensive. $174,000 is not a lot of money in DC. That salary doesn't cover it for a lot of members, and a lot of members of Congress end up sleeping in their offices because they can't afford to have a home back home and a home in DC. So when you hear about members of Congress earning a lot of money, think about that. I mean, it's really hard to afford 2 lifestyles on that. And especially, you know, they can't have another job. That is their full-time job. Okay, so a lot of them are independently wealthy before they're even elected. Perks. Some of the perks include travel allowances. A travel allowance maybe isn't as generous as it's thought of. The travel allowance basically is just allows them to travel back home. You know, it gives them the money to hop on an airplane and go back and see allows them to go back home and see their constituents. It gives them the textbook says it gives them ample staff. That's pretty generous. You know, there were maybe about 7 of us in each office. It's not ample. I mean, it's fine. The staffs are usually overworked. You get franking privileges, which is, you know, free mail that can be sent to your constituents telling them what's going on. You get free parking at the Reagan Airport, the book says, which I thought was interesting. Anyway, you get health and life insurance and a pension, but if you work there for a certain amount of time. Theirs is the same as mine. A member of Congress doesn't get any health and life insurance and pension that's any different than a person who works. We were all on the same, like, healthcare and all of that, their staff and the members themselves. All right. Job security, non-existent. For the members, for the staff, you know, no matter how hard you work, you're sure to face an opponent, you see me, in the next election who claims that you didn't do enough, you didn't work hard enough. It's time for a change. So they have to work harder, raise more money, and be more popular just to keep your jobs. It's hard on families who divide their times. And a lot of people become disenchanted with the job. So what does it take to win? You just have to be, you know, politically, you need political and financial assets, you need experience. You have to think about strategy. Are you living in a district or state you can win? Are you a Republican in a Democratic state? Then you probably can't win. If you're a Republican in a Republican state, then maybe you can. Who's your opponent likely to be? If you're running against somebody who's been there for a long time, it's a lot harder to win. That's the incumbent. Incumbents are hard to beat. Can you get the funds necessary to run a winning campaign? It's expensive to run. What kind of a year is this? You know, is this a good year for Republicans? Is this a good year for Democrats? If it's a presidential election year like this year, the enthusiasm for a popular presidential candidate might sweep fellow party members to victory in the coattail effect, which is the added votes received by the congressional candidates of a winning presidential party. So, you know, maybe here in South Carolina, we are very excited to go vote for President Trump. And so other members that are running as Republicans are kind of going to be under his, like, coattail effect. Midterm law. So every 4 years a president is elected, but the House is elected every 2. So the 2 years in between. So 2022 is a midterm year. It's not a presidential year, but there are still members who are running for re-election. That's the tendency for a presidential party to lose congressional seats in off-year elections. That happens almost every time. So it happened. So President Trump got elected in 2016, and he had a Republican president, a Republican Senate, and a Republican House. Well, in 2018, you had a midterm loss. The Republicans were replaced by Democrats in the House in 2018. That happens almost every time. The presidential party loses congressional seats in off-year elections. All right, so now you've gotten the job. What does it take to be a representative? Descriptive representation is the idea that an elected body should mirror demographics, the population it represents. John Adams said that a representative assembly should be in miniature, an exact portrait of the people at large. It should think, feel, reason, and act like them. But Congress fails at that pretty miserably. Congress is dominated by lawyers and business people, very well-educated, advanced degrees. Many are millionaires because they can afford to have 2 lives and campaigns. Women and minorities are typically not as well represented. It's getting better. Obviously, we have a woman and a minority on the presidential ticket right now. Kamala Harris is running as the vice presidential nominee with Joe Biden right now. And so that's represents two demographics right there, a woman and a woman of color. So maybe this is changing. By the 1990s, all groups are starting to be represented better, but it's still a predominantly white male world in DC. Does it matter if Congress looks like the people it represents? A lot of times the concerns of the poor aren't represented well. Sometimes you want one of your own to represent you, but that sometimes takes the form of being more informed or having a greater sense of efficiency. Sometimes having a higher turnout. For instance, when Obama was elected, it increased the number of people of color who went to the polls. And so, that sometimes does help to have somebody who looks like you because you want to go and vote for them. But it doesn't necessarily always produce better policies for those groups. So, something to think about. All right. So the official business of Congress is making laws, the rules that determine where the power is and who can exercise it. Congress is organized along party lines. In each chamber, the party with the most members, the majority party, decides the rules for the House. So for the rules for the chamber. So in the House right now, the Democrats are in charge. So they get the top leadership post, the Speaker of the House, and then in the Senate is controlled by Republicans. So they get the top leadership post, the majority leader, and the party in charge gets all the chairmanships of all the committees and subcommittees. Majority party is the party with the most seats in the House of Congress. Party is also important because it's the mechanism for members' advancement. Each party kind of determines who is going to be, the next chairman of this committee. They kind of control their own rules. But party stands for different things. The Democrats are typically more liberal, Republicans are more conservative. But when they win, they vote for different things. Party polarization. This is the greater ideological liberal versus conservative differences between the parties and increased ideological consensus between the parties. So we are more polarized. We are hyper partisan right now. Almost all Democrats are very liberal. Almost all Republicans are very conservative. There are a few in between right now. And so it makes it a lot harder to get actual work done because you need the support of both parties a lot of times to get things done. Leadership. Majority and minority parties elect their own leaders, and the Constitution provides for some of the election of specific congressional offices, but the Congress itself determines how much power each chamber will have. The main leadership offices are the Speaker of the House, that is the leader of the majority party, who serves as the presiding officer for the House of Representatives. Right now, that's Nancy Pelosi. She's a Democrat, and she's the Speaker of the House. She is the leader of the House. The majority leader of the Senate is Mitch McConnell. We talked about earlier. He's a Republican, and so he's the leader of the Senate. The Senate, the presiding officer of the Senate, though, is not the not the same. So the presiding officer of the House is the Speaker of the House. The presiding officer of the Senate is technically the Vice President of the United States. Because there are 100 seats, there could technically be a tie. So the Vice President of the United States is there to cast a tie-breaking vote when necessary, which he may have to do when they're voting on the confirmation of Amy Barrett as the Supreme Court Justice coming up. All right, both parties and both chambers have what's called a whip, which comes from an old English hunting expression. That they're elected by party members, and they are intended to find out how their members of their party intend to vote. So before you have a vote on the House floor or the Senate floor, that party's whip will call your office and say, hey, how is your boss planning to vote for this? And if they kind of get a head count, they think something is going to pass, and they'll go ahead and put it on the floor and kind of already know if it's going to pass or not. That's called the whip. They kind of whip them into, if they are not voting for what the party wants them to vote for, they can say, what can we do to negotiate an amendment for you? How can we end up getting your support? So it's a pretty important position. Leadership powers. Leaders can exercise only the power that their party members give them. Strong leaders can really move legislation along. There is a seniority system in place that the accumulation of power and the authority in conjunction with the length of time that's spent in office. Newt Gingrich was one of the most powerful speakers in modern era. He was in there in 1994. And then Nancy Pelosi, was the first female speaker, and she's back in office again. She is kind of a champion of democratic power. Okay, the committee system. if the Congress and the House, if the House of Representatives and the Senate met as a full body, it would be hard for the House and Senate to consider and deliberate on 10,000 bills that get introduced every year and 100,000 nominations that receive every 2 years. This is broken up and sent to committees. The Constitution says nothing about the committees. They're completely creatures of the chambers of Congress that they serve. The longer service on a committee permits members to develop an expertise and specialization in a particular party area. So the committees really work out the nitty-gritty details of legislation. They consider alternatives, they draft legislation. They're the information gatherers of Congress. They hold hearings and act as kind of the eyes and ears and workhorses of Congress. They do more than write the laws. They undertake congressional oversight to see that executive agencies are carrying out the laws, and that takes up a lot of time as well. So there are 4 types of committees. There are standing committees that are permanent committees responsible for legislation in a particular policy area. For example, I've worked for the Small Business Committee, the Judiciary Committee, and the Oversight Committee. They carry over from one Congress to the next, and they're typically divided into subcommittees that focus on detailed levels of policy. The size and ratio of minority and majority parties is kind of, if you have, 51% Democrats and 49% Republicans, it's going to be the same ratio as the whole House as it is in the smaller committees, if that makes sense. So you're going to have maybe one extra person on each committee of the majority party. The House Rules Committee is the committee that determines how and when debate takes place on a bill. A select committee is a committee appointed to deal with an issue or problem that's not suited to a standing committee. So this is like in 2014, they came up with the House Select Committee on Benghazi that had investigated what happened in Benghazi, and Trey Gowdy from South Carolina chaired that. Joint committees, these are combined House and Senate committees formed to coordinate activities and expedite legislation. And then there are conference committees. These are temporary committees formed to reconcile differences in the House and Senate versions of a bill. So before a bill is passed, they have to go to conference, and that's when they bring a few members of each party and each chamber together to kind of work out the bill to make sure it gets passed the correct way. So you want to make sure you're on the right committee. A lot of work is done at the committee level, so it's important for your reelection to be on the right one to best serve your constituency. You don't want to be on a committee that has nothing to do with your state, that really, you can't go home and say, I did this for my state, if it's a committee that really, doesn't have a whole lot to do with your folks. So it's important. Seniority is an important thing that's taken into consideration, and those who are very supportive of their party, who are good members and kind of vote the way they should, the way the party wants them to, they're typically rewarded with better committee spots. The vast majority of congressional staff works for an individual member or a committee. They are usually doing legislative work or constituency work. They also have interns. If you're ever interested in interning in DC, let me know. I can hook you up with some great folks to talk to. It's a very important and very interesting job, something I did that kind of got me started. I actually paged at this state house in South Carolina when I was at Carolina before, and that originally got me started, and then I interned on the Hill and then just stayed for a long time. Okay, so Congress is reluctant to be, I'm gonna have to wrap this up soon. Congress is reluctant to be dependent on the executive branch, so they have some folks that do some research for them as well. There are separate houses that have to come up with identical pieces of legislation, and there are informal rules that govern the behavior in Congress that are called norms. So when a bill becomes a law, you have to think of different slates of proposals and issues that consider how you would act on something. A bill has to be introduced by a member of Congress and then referred to committee. It goes to subcommittee, and then it goes to the Rules Committee, where they decide how and when it's going to be voted on the floor. The Senate, you can filibuster something, and that is the practice of unlimited debate. It can only be stopped by something called cloture, which is a vote to end Senate filibuster, which requires a 3/5 majority. So it's kind of a nuclear option. So that's if a filibuster is threatened, basically you are done in the Senate. Congressional leaders deal with a logjam of bills sometimes by packaging them together in what's called an omnibus, which is a large bill that contains a lot of things in it. A bill can be killed or left to die in committee, or it can be passed on the floor. When they're going to vote, there are multiple ways to vote. There can be a roll call vote, which is a publicly recorded vote. And then there could be just a simple yay or nay. All in favor say voice vote, yay or nay, or you can roll call and count votes that way. The president can override, can decide not to. He can veto a bill, and then Congress could override a presidential veto by a 2/3 vote. Let's see. I think that's about, yes. He could also has what's called a pocket override, which is his authority to kill a bill submitted within 10 days at the end of a legislative session by not signing it. All right, that was a lot. I think this is a really interesting topic, and I could talk about it for a really long time, but that is a lot for me to go through this week. Spend some time with this chapter, go through it, and let me know if you guys have any questions. This is my only lecture this week because this is a longer one, but definitely reach out and let me know if you have any questions, and I will talk to you guys next week. Thanks.